I can't emphasize enough how much the real estate business is all IRR driven. So it's all like, oh, we're going to fix this up and flip it. And I was like, I had done that in my original deals. And I was like, this is fucking crazy. Like, that is not what you should do when you own good real estate. But I felt like I was a crazy person.
Right.
Because I was like thinking about the world just like fundamentally differently than how everyone else in the industry was. And partly it was because I didn't know any better and I didn't have a mentor. So I just like did what seemed smart to me.
Well, you went back to your first principles, and it just happened to be unconventional by the current norms.
Exactly.
Welcome to Transitions, a podcast that explores the inflection points and critical moments behind the success of today's business leaders. I'm your host, Tim Ludwig. In each episode, I interview a successful founder, investor, or entrepreneurial leader and explore their lives' most critical moments. You'll hear stories of growth and resilience and find inspiration to help you navigate your own crucible moments. You can access all episodes, including transcripts, at transitionspodcast.com. My guest today is Moses Kagan, the co-founder at Adaptive Realty, founder of Reconvene, a leading real estate private equity unconference, and partner at Reseed, which has been described as Y Combinator for real estate sponsors. Moses has a fascinating background, and some of what we discuss in this episode includes how self-advocacy and competitiveness influenced his path in education and business, his journey to a successful real estate career, and the role of mentors in life and business. Please enjoy my conversation with Moses Kagan. I thought it might be good to start just with sort of a general overview of your childhood and upbringing, where you're from, what it was like in the home environment, and then we'll sort of move on from there more or less chronologically.
Born to parents who remain married, have a brother who is 18 months younger than I am, grew up in Troy, New York, which is near Albany, which is definitely the provinces, as we'll talk about later, because that played into the story. My father is the child of Holocaust survivors. He was born in a refugee camp in Germany immediately after the war.
Wow.
He lived in the refugee camp until he was 5 or so, when his parents took him to Israel, where his father died as a result of beatings that he had received immediately in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So then he resisted his mother getting remarried until this man, Elliot, came and offered to marry her and take her to the United States, where he had family. And my father sort of allowed his mother to marry Elliot because he thought the idea of going to the United States was cool. So he came to the United States when he was 13 and lived in the Bronx and had like a real immigrant experience. They had a deli. When he first got here, he asked his mother if he could have some pizza. Mm-hmm. And she said, "Don't be silly. That's just bread and jam." That's how disconnected they were. They had a deli. They never really prospered. I knew them well, Elliot and Luba, my grandmother. He went to high school in New York. He was a really good student. He got into MIT and some other of the best schools, but RPI in Troy offered him a full scholarship.
Okay.
And he's let's call it high on the the disagreeable scale. And so wanted nothing to do with owing his parents anything. So chose RPI because he wouldn't know them anything. My mother had a slightly different story. Her parents were American, but her grandfather, Morris, who I've talked about online a lot, came from Russia when he was 15. And
is he the one that had the real estate?
Yes, he had So first he had a grocery business. And first he was candling eggs, then he was selling butter and dairy and then he opened grocery stores, and then he bought real estate as a result of that. So, and then he had a son, Leonard, who was my grandfather, and I knew both Morris and Leonard well growing up. Leonard was sort of a quintessential small businessman, had a deli, had a toy store, eventually ended up owning real estate and actually being a broker. So my mother had, let's call it a lower middle to middle class upbringing initially in Queens and then in Spring Valley, New York, which is a little north of New York City. Went to State University of Albany, which is where she met my father, because my father was in Troy. They're near each other. And they basically got married and settled there. And that's why I grew up there.
Okay. Then you went to a very unconventional elementary school.
Yeah, my parents were hippies. My father went to Woodstock. My mother, interestingly, and this will be a recurring theme, my mother was interested in being a hippie, but the idea of going to Woodstock where there were no showers was like a non-starter for her. there was like already a kind of a bourgeois like theme running through there as well.
She was a hygienic hippie.
Yes, exactly. For whatever that's worth. And actually eventually one who like totally frowned on drugs and became like very straight-laced and has probably had like 10 drinks in her entire life. But yeah, so they were ex-hippies. And my father, who started out studying aeronautical engineering, eventually became an artist.
Wow, that's a pivot.
Yeah, well, it was the 60s. Yeah. And so they had us and they put us in, my brother and I, in this school called the M. Willard Children's School, which I believe does not exist anymore, but it was on the campus of an all-girls boarding school called M. Willard. And the woman who was running it was this wonderful woman named Marlisa Parker, who is long dead, but like was a really amazing educator and built this school that was, I think, ahead of its time in terms of being very inclusive and liberal and kind, no grades, no competition. And it was a wonderful place, so that's where I went from whatever pre-K through, it ended in third grade.
Yeah.
That was kind of the beginning of my education.
And the point that I'd probably punctuate from our prior conversation is it was very unstructured.
Unstructured and crucially, as I said before, not competitive.
Right.
Until, I can't remember if it was second or third grade. I think it was probably third grade. They wanted us to learn our math times tables. And so they started giving us quizzes. And this girl in the class, who funnily enough now lives in Los Angeles, and she's a lawyer for the ACLU, I noticed that after a few of the quizzes, she got to stop taking them because she got everything right over and over and over again. And that, for some reason, triggered this intense competitiveness in me. And I more or less forced my parents to study the times tables with me until I knew them perfectly so that I could get out of taking the tests also. And I think I'm sure I was competitive with my brother before then, but I don't really remember it. But that was like the moment in my life where I think what I think is my natural competitiveness emerged in a way that actually shaped my life.
Yeah. And with competitiveness, are you competing with yourself typically?
Definitely not.
It's external. You create a villain or a target.
It's not so much a villain or a target. It was like, oh, there's this person who is being acknowledged as somehow smarter than me. And fuck that. You know what I mean? And so, I mean, I don't, for anyone who has been in therapy or whatever, who is listening to this, I'm sure they're sitting there going like, that is not a healthy setup. But it is what it is. I mean, that was, and that I think as we'll see, as we talk more about my background, I think that was like a crucial force that shaped my life.
And so out of that elementary school, where did you go next?
Yeah. So now things start to get even more interesting. My parents we didn't have a lot of money. My father was a college professor, an artist and a college professor. My mom was working in state government. They had started to buy some real estate so that they were maybe a little bit better off than you would think from those professions, but we did not have a lot of money. But my mother in particular was always insistent on spending basically like an unlimited amount of money on education.
Yeah.
She was, I didn't realize it so much at the time, obviously as a child, but like, as I think we'll see from this conversation, I think one of the through strands of my life is that my mother was like engaged in a reasonably conscious project of bumping us up the class ladder, both like financially, but also educationally or however all the things,
all the dimensions.
So the best school, I'm not sure if it actually was the best school, but the school that everyone thought was the best in upstate New York, or in where we lived, was the Albany Academy for Boys.
Okay.
Which was at that time an all-boys military school that had been founded, I think, around the Civil War or maybe even earlier. and was about what you would expect from an all boys military school, like heavy emphasis on athletics, marching with guns, uniforms,
discipline, order, rigor.
Yeah. But also like, so yes, but also like, because it's a bunch of boys, like Lord of the Flies in a certain kind of way. So almost like the polar opposite of the Emma Willard Children's School in the sense of like not at all nurturing.
Yeah.
So I went from this, cocoon almost to being chucked into not a warm place.
Yeah. And how was that transition?
It was okay. I mean, a couple of things. First of all, you had to test to get in.
Okay.
And I had never taken a test before besides those math quizzes. So I screwed up the multiple choice, the Scantron.
Right.
And I was like, I remember crying in this like takeout Mexican restaurant with my mother on test day, because I thought I'd fucked it up. It turned out that they were not that selective. Yeah. So it's like no problem. But at the time, I thought that was a big deal. Got there, liked it. This was fourth grade. And then I realized that they had divided the grade into 3 groups.
Okay.
And it was like, I think it was like blue group, green group, and red group. And with blue group being the slower kids, green group, which I was in, being the kind of like medium kids, and red group being the advanced kids academically. And
I can see where this is going.
Yeah. And that, again, that like triggered me. It was like, what? Because I was new, they just put me in the middle group because that was, but I immediately went on campaign with my parents and then via my parents with the school to get put into red group. And I got put into red group, and then a few other kids did the same. And then that forced them eventually to like to reorganize the class because I guess too many kids were asking or whatever. But yeah, it was, again, I just didn't want to, just the idea of not being in the smart group was just not tolerable to me. So I think that competitiveness continued and grew there.
Was it mostly just about smarts and intelligence, or did it show up in other places as well?
Eventually in wrestling. So the school had a heavy emphasis on sports, and this is, in retrospect, this is great. And I think more schools should do this. It's insane that they don't. We had an hour and 20 minutes of gym every day.
Wow.
And the school had a relatively small student body, and we competed against larger public schools. So the way they did that was that first of all, when you were young, they rotated you through all of the different competitive sports. So you do like a month of basketball, a month of wrestling, a month of hockey. And then as you got a little older, they forced you to be on 3 sports teams. Okay. And I was this like skinny little Jewish kid. I'm not particularly athletic, but my brother and I used to fight all the time. And my grandfather got sick of it at a certain point and taught us how to wrestle because he figured that we wouldn't kill each other if there were rules. And so when we got to the wrestling module in gym class, and I think this was in 6th grade, I won my weight class, the like little school class tournament. Not that I was that good, but I was just because I practiced a little bit, I was better than the other kids. And so I went to the school the next year in 7th grade. I was aware that there was a middle school wrestling team, which was intended for 7th and 8th graders. But for some reason, I think that the 7th grade schedule did not normally put kids onto that team or whatever. And I, again, went on campaign, and myself and then eventually this other kid were allowed to join what was effectively the 8th grade wrestling team. What that meant was, because our schedules weren't set up for it, we had to practice with varsity because the varsity practiced after the 7th grade day was over. So we were on the 8th grade wrestling team, but we practiced with varsity. And so I was, again, now I'm in this varsity wrestling practice, easily the smallest, unathletic, getting bullied and getting my ass kicked every day and crying. My mom would pick me up from after practice, and this other kid who was my age, who was a little bigger and more physically mature than I was, and would beat me every day. And I was so frustrated, and I would get in the car afterwards, and I would be crying in the car that this kid Todd kept beating me.
Yeah.
But my response to that, rather than quitting, was to insist that my parents send me to wrestling camp. And they sent me to Syracuse wrestling camp, where I didn't know anyone, where I was again probably the worst wrestler there, where I got my head kicked in for a week. Like there's wrestling all day.
Yeah.
And then when you're not wrestling, you're just basically sitting around. And it was all these kids from like rural upstate New York who were really good wrestlers, but had basically nothing in common with me culturally. I mean, I was probably the only Jew there. And I was really homesick, but I got a lot better. And when I came back the next year, I was actually good. And I remember like distinctly like beating Todd and then again, and then like really it was like this moment of feeling like I had been bad at something and then I worked really hard at it and got good at it.
Yeah, that seems like a theme. The other one that is a little bit more subtle that I keep hearing about is this self-advocacy. Like you're in a situation that doesn't align with your inner version of where you should be. And you actually go, with grown adults advocating for yourself at a young age.
Yeah. And I did it again. So in 7th grade, I realized that I wanted to be pushed ahead in English. Part of it was that I didn't love the 8th grade English teacher. And I loved the 7th grade English teacher, but I knew I didn't like the 8th grade English teacher. And I also just wanted to get pushed ahead.
Yeah.
So I remember making my father come with me to meet with the head of the middle school. Like before school started in the morning, we were sitting in an empty cafeteria and I effectively like made my case to be pushed ahead into 9th grade English.
Yeah.
And the school, to their credit, acceded and allowed me to do it. And again, so now I'm in a class, I'm younger than all the kids in the English class. And I was physically small. And I happened to be in this class with a bunch of like football players. And they picked on me. This is the school. Like there's a recurring theme. There's a lot of hazing stuff that if it happened now, I mean, people would go to jail probably.
Right.
So my response to their picking on me was to correct their pronunciation of words, which at a certain point, the English teacher, this wonderful guy named Mr. Hansen, like pulled me aside and was like, listen, like for your own physical safety,
knock it off.
Like knock that off. And I just didn't know, like no one had told me how to, like in some ways, I think my father having not had a father and also being an immigrant and therefore, and just like having gone to public, like he just had like no frame of reference for any of this stuff. And so maybe he did give me advice and I didn't listen, but I kind of like don't remember. There were a lot of things that I had to figure out for myself, I guess is the right way to put it. Or learn from someone like Mr. Hansen, who like took me aside and was like, hey, this is not how you act.
Yeah.
So that was another example of it. And then as we'll talk about, the next one was forcing my way into boarding school.
Yeah. Let's go there. You went to Andover.
Yeah. Actually, even before that, I saw a sign at the Albany Academy in 7th grade for the Center for Talented Youth, where they let you take the SATs in 7th grade. And if you do well enough, you get to take college classes in the summer.
Right.
And so
camp for smart kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nerd camp. Effectively.
Right.
And again, I think I don't know. I think it was the test, the idea of being tested. So I went on campaign, got my mom to sign me up for it, took the SATs when I was in 7th grade.
Wow.
Didn't do particularly well on math, but I scored.
Yeah, because you were in 7th grade.
Yeah. But I scored highly enough on the verbal that I got like a national award. So then I went to CT. So then I spent the next 3 summers in addition to like wrestling camp, and I actually was going to like Jewish summer camp as well. I went to nerd camp.
Yeah.
And I got exposed there to kids who had gone to prep school.
Okay.
And I also had a girlfriend at the Albany Academy for Girls who then went to Andover. And so like that, so I had the idea was
the seed was planted.
The seed was planted. And it was like, oh, okay, there's this opportunity to go to the school with, first of all, girls, no uniforms, no parents, and like really smart kids and interesting teachers.
Yeah.
And I seized that opportunity.
And a bigger pond. It seems like one of the things that was happening throughout your childhood was you trying to measure yourself against other people and where did you stack up? And
yeah, I think that's exactly right. And then, and by the way, my parents were like actually opposed to me going. Like they thought that it was going to, they had some advice from a family member that like it was going to make it harder for me to get into really good colleges. And it was better to be a big fish in a small pond from a college applications perspective than to go to Andover and be like mediocre, basically. And I was just like not having that.
Yeah.
So I really, it was a fight. Like, I really pushed and they, to their credit,
prevailed.
Yeah. And I got like a partial scholarship, but it was expensive. I mean, they had to take loans and we were doing better financially by that point. So it wasn't like an extreme hardship, but it was definitely like them prioritizing education.
That's just a quick aside. I remember I went to a private middle school, and after I graduated from college, when the student loan kicks in, all of a sudden I got this notice from my middle school that I had student loans due that I had no idea. Like I was 12 years old. Like, well, I didn't know about student loans, but apparently I signed up for them and the obligation followed me all the way through.
Amazing. And my parents, I didn't ever have any debt. And, partially it was scholarships, partially my dad's college paid for some of my college, but like it was a real struggle. And my parent, I'm obviously eternally grateful to them for doing that. We didn't go on like fancy vacations. My father's never had a new car like his entire life. Like, I mean, it was real. It was a real prioritization decision.
Yeah.
So yeah. But I got to Andover and I was not a big fish in Andover. It was like, I kept pushing the limits and I was like, okay. And that was a wonderful experience because it was in one sense humbling,
right?
To come across people who were so much smarter than me. Then another thing that happened was, and this, I swear I don't know where this idea came from, but I remember distinctly deciding that I was okay and indeed welcomed being the dumbest one of my friends.
Such a turnabout from earlier on.
And I don't know I don't know where that idea came from or where that, but so I consciously sought out a friend group of people who were high achieving, ambitious, really smart. Yeah. In ways that we can talk about that absolutely shaped my life later.
Why don't you talk about those ways?
Oh, I mean, well, the first job I ever got, I started a company in college with those people. It didn't go anywhere, but we raised a bunch of money from adults. So it was like the idea that you could, like a person could just like get some legal docs drafted, go out with an idea and get like serious people to write a check for serious money, even if you were,
Got it. So they just expanded the universe of possibilities. Yeah.
So that was the first thing. The next thing was when I graduated from London School of Economics I had like a history master's from LSE. One of my best friends from there got me my first job, which was in banking. And I had like no preparation, no nothing. It was purely because they thought he was smart and the company that he was working for was their biggest client. So when he recommended me, they were like, okay, we'll take a chance on this kid who has no preparation. Yeah. Nothing in his background would lead you to believe that he would be good at this job.
He's a history major.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And it turned out like I wasn't good at the job in many ways. I was good at it in a few important ways. So, and then another one of my best friends from there first provided capital for another failed startup that I did with my brother. That was sort of the impetus for me moving back to Los Angeles from London. And then ultimately the same guy provided the capital for my 2nd through 12th real estate deals.
Okay.
Subsequently, other friends from there have invested in various of the real estate projects that I've done. So, I mean, really, it was like, it made my life. I mean, that friend group in all those different ways totally made my life.
Yeah, that sounds incredible.
Yeah. I mean, it really was. And, it shaped my life. And interestingly, like not everyone there had that experience. In other words, it wasn't like, that's like not a normal outcome so I think that we had a particularly talented class. I think like when viewed against the other, so it was just luck that we had a talented class. And then I made an effort to seek out and befriend this group of people who were particularly talented.
The part that I'm fascinated by in this part of your journey is this going from this hyper-competitive person that needs to almost wills themselves to the top of the pile to now being in a bigger pond and being comfortable sort of just being a part of the crowd and not the top of the pile. Like,
yeah, let me tell you a story, a short one. My mom married my dad in large part because, well, first of all, because he was a Holocaust survivor. Being Jewish was meaningful to her. And so there was there was that going on. But also because he's really smart. Like she was very like, and he's I'm sure he won't mind me saying, he's a pain in the ass in many ways. Like he's disagreeable, as I think I was saying before. Like he's not an easy person always to be around, and certainly has not been easy for her to be married to. Yeah. She hasn't always been easy either. So I mean, they have an interesting marriage, but she picked him because he was smart.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that was that normal back then. I think now there's more of like a understanding of how important raw intelligence is to outcomes. Like if you're paying attention to social science research, like it's correlated with all kinds of positive things. So I don't know what was going on, but I think if you look back, I think I always tried to, at some level, I was like trying to put myself around a bunch of really intelligent people. And so then when I finally found myself like in a group of really intelligent people, like it was heaven for me.
Yeah.
And I was,
it wasn't competitive. You could just sort of acknowledge that they might be your betters in certain areas.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, and I just want to emphasize, it's not like a little bit better.
Yeah. Okay.
You know what I mean? Like one of my best friends was like on the national physics team.
Okay.
Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it is like a certified gene, like
right.
You know, like it's not, there were ways that I could compete with someone like that in the specific areas where I'm good, but like it was futile to try to compete with someone like that across the board.
Yeah. Well, that just sounds like good common sense then.
Yeah.
So let's skip ahead then maybe, unless there's something about college that you want to talk about, and talk about now going to the start of the real estate career.
Sure. I think the thing I'll say about college is just that I was pretty aimless there. And this is a mistake that I made that I hope I try to tell people not to repeat. I viewed college in some way, getting into Princeton, as like the culmination, the end of the race.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, that was very stupid.
Mm-hmm.
The right way to think about college is the beginning of the race. And I should have taken a year off probably and like recharged after Andover and then gone to school. So I went there and I was kind of like, I got good grades and everything, but I spent most of my time like partying and trying to be cool or something, and not using that time as to like start preparing myself for my career. And in fact, I was like I had this vague idea that I wanted to be a corporate lawyer or something, but I didn't really even know what that meant or talk to any of them. I was kind of floating through college.
And you weren't pursuing any classes or direction or internships in corporate law?
No, not at all. And and my parents were so like disconnected from the like professional, like I had friends who would get like internships at investment banks.
Yeah.
And my first internship was at a labor union.
Okay.
Which, I mean, it's a whole other story. So yeah, I think I sort of floated through that experience. And then I kind of went to grad school because I wanted the law schools to be able to see my senior year grades. So I basically had to burn a year. So I was like, I'll go get a master's degree. And during that year in London for the master's, I kind of realized that I didn't want to be a lawyer, but I had not like gone through any of the finance training. Yeah. I hadn't done anything. I had no skills. I had no real direction. So anyway, so I floated into that. My friend got me this job in banking, and so that kind of tipped me along. But I didn't know what a DCF was. I didn't know, I never took a single finance or accounting class. I didn't know anything about business. I used to read the newspaper every day, but I would skip the business section because it was so boring. Very stupid. So I knew that I wanted to make money almost because like my parents spoiled us. And so I knew, but they were like, we're not going to support you as an adult. So I knew I wanted to have a nice standard of living. So I needed to make money, but I had no concept of any of this stuff.
Yeah. Where do you start?
Right. And no guidance. Like my parents are just not, and they owned a small apartment portfolio, but like they weren't.
Your dad was an artist. Your mom worked for the state government.
Exactly. Yeah. So there was no like entrepreneurial, but no one was, and part of, or maybe not PS, but parenthetically, part of the why I do what I do in terms of talking publicly and writing and everything is because I very much feel like an obligation or something to people who are in a similar situation, who are ambitious and want to do something financially for their families, but like who don't know what to do.
So what advice do you give them?
I mean, God, where do we even begin? The simplest thing to say is that I have recently just been recommending that they read Naval Ravikant's thread, How to Get Rich Without Getting Lucky. because I think it's the most well thought out and succinct description of wealth creation in the 21st century.
Okay.
So, I mean, there's a whole bunch. We could go through and
Yeah.
talk about all those different things, what's in there and why I think that.
But the people you're trying to help are primarily people that have ambition to build wealth.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think I have a bunch of friends who have gone into things. I have a friend who's a very senior editor, very, very senior editor at like one of the biggest newspapers in the world. I have friends who have become tenured college professors. And I have enormous amounts of respect for those people. That's not like, I was greedier than that.
Yeah.
So I don't know that I have much to share with people who have those kind of other non-pecuniary ambitions.
Sure. Makes sense. Where were we?
You asked me about my real estate career. Okay.
Yeah. If we can jump to that. I mean,
Sure.
it sounds like the clay was being molded in sort of a haphazard way. You were following interests and looking for ways to challenge yourself and find peers that you could continue to learn from and would continue to push you to be your best self, and stumble out of banking.
Yeah, I stumbled out of banking. I decided I wanted to do something where I had ownership. That was a good insight. Started this. My brother had this sort of a half-assed idea. I added to it and made it a little less half-assed, but it was basically a pretty half-assed idea that involved providing software to like actors and casting directors in Hollywood. Very stupid.
Okay.
Like, don't do small TAM tech startups. But again, there wasn't this like that. That wasn't well known. At least, like there wasn't like there weren't podcasts and books or really at that point. But anyway, so that was my excuse to come back to Los Angeles.
Okay.
So we did that. It became clear that was not going to make us particularly wealthy, although it persisted for 10 years. It was actually, it turned out to be kind of an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Half-assed execution, but of a very good idea, but like of a sufficiently small scale that it didn't justify additional capital. So it just kind of like puttered along. So then the GFC happened and there were no jobs. So I was like, at this point I was married. I knew I needed to provide for my family. There were no jobs. Immediately before the GFC, my brother and I wanted to own a duplex, like an apartment building with 2 units. Real estate was like in the air.
Yeah. And in your family.
Yeah, in our family, right. And so we started looking. We tried to find a duplex to buy. The pricing was insane, even to our like naive eyes. It just didn't make sense. My brother found a guy who had renovated a 16-unit building and got himself in trouble and was willing to sell it cheap. And so we bought that with our parents' help. They put up the dough. And we bought that building. And then the GFC happened. Yeah. And real estate kind of went on sale. And I was like, I hadn't taken any real estate courses. I didn't even know that real estate private equity existed. Like I probably had never said the words real estate private equity. Like I had no nothing.
And were you thinking at that point that this could be a career and that this was entrepreneurial, or this was just opportunistic, that prices seemed cheap? We're already sort of in this. Let's just keep doing it.
Imagine a person who is drowning, who like piece of driftwood drifts by and they grab onto it because they don't want to drown.
That was you.
That was me.
Okay.
So it was the opposite of like a well-considered strategic decision to enter Los Angeles multifamily real estate.
No business plan, no macro outlook, or
not at all. What we did know was with the second deal, the first one that I raised outside money from and turned out to be a friend. Yeah. Was the building was cheap. The apartments were screwed up. They were being rented cheap. The location was really good. So we figured if we fixed the apartments up, we could get higher rents and it would work out. And I'm sure our underwriting was like insanely naive. I haven't looked back at it recently. I mean, we did everything wrong. Like
right.
I could go for a long time about all mistakes we made, but fundamentally that like insight was right. And because we were at that time, we renovated buildings unit by unit instead of doing the whole thing at once. So it only took a few units turning over and getting higher rents for them for us to be able to go back to my friend and say, this is working.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. So we didn't have to go full cycle with the deal. It was like, okay. And so we pretty quickly ended up buying like 10 or 11 more buildings with his money and executing more or less the same business plan for all those. So it was like this, it was totally opportunistic.
Yeah.
And we screwed up so much, but it was like sort of going to real estate undergrad and maybe grad school, like in this very compressed period of time. Ordinarily, if you're going to do a career like real estate, you raise money, for your first deal. You scrape together like friends and family money, you do a $2 million deal, you go full cycle on it. And then you could say, okay, we've raised, we did well. Can we raise 5 million? Okay. My friend, for reasons we could get into or not, was willing to go much faster than that. And so we effectively did like 10 or 11 deals within 2 years.
You didn't have to prove out the full cycle. You just go. Yeah.
And so the downside was that we made a ton of mistakes because there wasn't enough feedback time to but the upside was the cadence, the number of reps we got was in such a compressed period of time was like very unusual.
That's interesting because, it's one of the benefits of people starting real estate in brokerage is just the number of reps you get in a very short period of time.
Totally.
You got it in a different way as a principal instead of as a broker.
Yeah. And it was luck and this good relationship with my friend and whatever. And I don't want to minimize my brother and an employee who subsequently became my partner were instrumental in all of it. It wasn't just me. I mean, but it worked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what point on that journey did you think this is going to stick? I'm going to keep doing this and not look for the next software idea or...
Oh, dude, I was looking at LinkedIn for years after that. It was, you know what I mean? Like because I wasn't making much money. I mean, we had a very stupid structure for those deals with my friend that was no fee. So we couldn't live. So eventually we went back to him and we made a deal where we could borrow from the LLC to live on, but we'd have to pay it back. Effectively, we were borrowing at the pref rate, is the way to think about it. And so imagine living, at this point I started to have kids and I have a wife, I have kids, and I'm living on like borrowed money.
That sounds stressful.
It was insanely stressful. And my brother and I were both managers. So we were fighting with each other about what deals to do or what, whatever. And there was no decision maker. So these fights were like pretty vicious and interminable. And we were living on borrowed money. It was an extremely stressful part of my life.
Yeah.
It was not good.
And then somewhere in there, their original partner said, I'm done.
Yeah. So I think like in late 2011, he was kind of like, okay, you guys need to grow up and rely, get other capital sources. Yeah. And I'm not going to just be your like sugar daddy or whatever. Crucially, he gave us through the end of 2012 to sell. So I had the time to set things up so that it wasn't just being like pushed off of a bridge or something. Like it was very kind of him to like, he did it and we're very good friends and best friends to this day. So, I mean, but he did it in a way that helped me, that sort of bridged me to torture the metaphor into an independent.
So you think that was the right thing to do for him and for you looking back?
Well, it was definitely the right thing for me career-wise. Yeah. In retrospect, what we should have done is refinance those buildings and held them. I mean, we would have made, we gave up.
Basis was so low.
Oh my God, we left so much value on the table painfully, some of the people who bought those buildings from us hired me to continue managing them. So I got like a ringside seat as like the rents went up. It was, and it is what it is. I mean,
sometimes you'd rather not know.
Yeah, exactly. So it was not great from a financial perspective, but the way to think about it is imagine you're a bodybuilder. Okay. But you neglect like your right arm. Okay. And you're like incredibly powerful in your legs and your left arm and but your right arm is just neglected.
Yeah.
Okay. That's what we were with respect to doing real estate deals. We knew how to source deals. We knew how to execute them. We knew how to manage them, but we didn't know how to raise money. And so all of those skills are, if you can't raise money in real estate, those skills are, I mean, they're okay. You can, but basically you're a bodybuilder with one limp arm.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
So because we had been able to just rely on him, anytime we wanted to buy something, it was like one phone call, send him an email. He'd say, sure. And we'd do it. And so I'd never taken the opportunity, I'd never been forced to like develop a network of partners who could finance deals. And so when he cut us loose and when I started Adaptive in 2012, we had all these skills, but we had no access to capital. And so effectively we had to like rebuild that arm, learn how to do that.
And that fell mostly on your shoulders.
That fell entirely on my shoulders. Okay. Yeah.
And the picture here is that you were an outsider. Real estate is an industry where I think it's possible to be an outsider and to work your way in. But that you probably felt very much like an outsider and probably very ill-equipped to go and figure out how to raise capital.
Yes. And again, remember that I have like hippie parents.
Mhm.
The only country club in Troy, I don't even think let Jews in when I lived there, right? I don't know how to play golf.
Yeah.
I did have this good prep school network,
Mhm.
and I had a decent network from Princeton.
Mhm.
So, and those things helped. But yeah, it was very much like I had no mentor.
Mhm.
I had no network. Oh, and I wasn't even from Los Angeles.
Right.
So I've been living there for by this point for probably 5 years, but like I didn't go to private school here. All the ways that you were,
Yeah.
that you would, I wasn't a member of a temple. I wasn't
Right.
the ways that people.
You didn't
raised
have a
money.
network of
Didn't
high
have a
net worth people.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, what I did was basically start writing on the internet. Well, I mean, that was.
How did you think that would work?
Well, let me step back. So the first thing I did was Adaptive Realty Fund 1. I raised half the money, what I thought was all the money, but turned out to be half the money from like friends and family. Like,
Mhm.
and my original investor, I had to go to him. He was like, I'm not going to do anything. And I was like,
Yeah.
look, dude, there's a terrible signaling thing if you do that. So can you please put in a material of my money? And to his credit, he put in $500K to that first fund.
Yeah.
Which sort of resolved the signaling problem.
Mhm.
So then I think I raised $1.8 million total or something like that from friends and family. Our accountant, I asked him if he knew anyone, and he introduced me to this family that ended up putting up half the money for that fund and became to this day our largest source of capital. So that was like,
What a great connection.
oh, it was amazing. And I didn't even know when he made it. He didn't, I had no sense when I first met them that like they were this significant. And so, I mean, I probably would have been even more nervous than I was. And I was really nervous. But yeah, so that's where the first capital came from. But then at the same time as I was hustling to do that, and we can talk about all the other stuff that I was hustling to do at the same brokering, property management, I was building everything. I started writing on the internet because I read Seth Godin's Permission Marketing about basically like putting educational content out and getting inbound leads. And that felt like something I could do.
Yeah.
So I just started writing about my experience of buying, renovating, and managing apartment buildings because I had done all these deals. So actually I like knew a lot by that point about how to do the business.
That's a very liberal arts approach to capital raising.
Yeah, no, it fit me like a glove. I mean, the right thing to do is to start cold outreach, right?
Mhm.
Emails. And I mean, I don't know that LinkedIn was like, I don't know if that was quite as easy at that point, or cold calls,
Right.
but I just never, I don't know. I was afraid of that. I mean, I did a little bit of it and it didn't ever go anywhere, but I bet I've made 10 cold calls in my life or something like, maybe the cold outreach is 20 emails, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
It's a hard road and it takes volume.
And just a little grit. And in retrospect, it was very stupid. Like I should have done that. That's a very good strategy. But what felt good to me was just sort of putting my like learnings out into the world and having the world come to me and say, please take my capital. And it didn't like.
Was it that easy?
Yes and no. I mean, it wasn't fast.
Mm-hmm.
Because it takes a while to like build up their trust and reputation and everything. But it did happen.
Mm-hmm.
It did happen. And that snowballed. And eventually between 5 years of daily blogging and then eventually through Twitter, like I basically exploded my access to capital pretty much exclusively through writing.
Yeah. That's an amazing story.
I owe a lot to Seth Godin.
Right.
I mean, but it's funny when you think about it. If you think back to the story I told you before, like, I mean, I won a verbal prize for the SAT.
You're leaning into your strengths with this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like I've always been a good writer. Interestingly, like not a good creative writer and not an academic writer.
Mm-hmm.
Like I wasn't, I wrote academic papers in college and grad school and they were terrible.
Right.
But what I was always really good at was cranking out like a succinct, 3-page argument about something that's like logical and rational and the whole thing flows to a conclusion. And it turns out that that's actually a business writing, as you know, is like, it's not, it's way more about that. In fact, it's, 3 bullet points,
right?
Not 3 pages.
The more concise, the better.
Exactly. And I think so much of business is about communication. I mean, when I think back to the important things that have happened in my career, so much of them have been like a well-written email, or a well-written investor memo.
Yeah.
And it really is, it's not the quality of the writing in the way that an English teacher would say what's quality writing. It's the organization of and clarity of the thought, the way that it hangs together and is ordered. And
well, also I think if you write enough publicly, your values seep through, right? People really do get to know the real you, unless you're really, really good or really, really deranged, probably, and can hide that. But I think it's almost impossible. And so you build a personal brand.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's Brent Beshore who talks about how writing publicly is basically like building trust at scale.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I didn't have those words. It was funny because I had that blog experience. And when I got on Twitter and I sort of ran into finance Twitter and like started reading Brent's stuff and I found Brent and I was like, oh, this is exactly what I've been thinking.
Yeah.
And it was funny because he's in like a permanent hold. He buys and holds companies.
Right.
And so he had sort of independently arrived at the same conclusion about owning companies that I had arrived at about owning good real estate.
Yeah. You're close cousins philosophically in a lot of ways.
Exactly. And it was like, but I can't tell you how weird it was, or like, it was very strange before that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Buffett was helpful because Buffett does the same thing. So I can't emphasize enough how much the real estate business is all IRR driven. So it's all like, oh, we're going to fix this up and flip it. And I was like, I had done that in my original deals. And I was like, this is fucking crazy. Like that is not what you should do when you own good real estate. So, but I felt like I was a crazy person.
Right.
Because I was like thinking about the world just like fundamentally differently than how everyone else in the industry was. And partly it was because I didn't know any better and I didn't have a mentor. So I just like did what seemed smart to me.
Well, you went back to your first principles, and it just happened to be unconventional by the current norms.
Exactly. And so then reading Buffett, it was like, oh, okay, I'm not like completely crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's like, that's Warren Buffett. I'm not going to sit here and compare myself to Warren Buffett. So then when I found Brent's writing on Twitter, it was like, okay, like there are other people who are like mortals, let's say, who think about things the way that I do.
Right. Well, one of the things, like I got to know you through Twitter, and the persona that I came to like and respect deeply is someone that just exudes a really principled way of behaving, both in life and in business. And I know you're a humble person. Like these sorts of conversations, stir up all sorts of interesting thoughts in you. But like, I think there's a pretty widely held perception, at least in the real estate Twitter community, that I think you've been called the sheriff and like all these things, right? Like,
man.
And just curious.
I reject that for the record.
Well, that's what I'm curious about. Like, I mean, it comes from somewhere, right? And I'm not saying you could or should be the sheriff, but I think what it's really speaking to is that people look to you for moral guidance in some sense.
It's really weird because I really can't emphasize enough how much in my personal life, I'm divorced.
Yeah.
Like I was not a good husband. I would say I'm like a mediocre husband to my current wife, who's a wonderful person. I would say I'm like a mediocre father. I'm not like, I really can't emphasize enough how much I'm not a moral paragon. What I can say though, is with respect specifically to my partners, like, and even more specifically to people who trust me with money. So I have like a sincere appreciation for the difficulty of accumulating capital because I've been in the position of not having any and like earning money, and then you pay taxes, and then you're trying to support a family, and you realize how hard it is to just like save money.
Right. It's precious.
So people like bleed for it. Right. And because it was so hard for me to raise initially, right? Every single person who was like, okay, yeah, I'll do 250 grand, or okay, yeah, like I believe it. We'll do 5 million and we'll do this building with you. Like there was this feeling of like, oh my God, that like I'm being trusted in this like incredibly important way with this like incredibly valuable capital. And there's no guarantee that there's another person walking in the door. Like finding these people is not easy.
Yeah.
So we're going to just treat this like with the respect that it deserves. And so I think the conclusion that you draw, so if you have that mindset that you have partners who trust you with capital that is precious, okay? And the partners are precious. Then, and you can't afford to disappoint them. Then you can't do stuff that's dumb. Like you can make mistakes, but you're sitting there and you're going like, and every time you're confronted by a dilemma, should I do this deal or not? The deal is like I'm looking at a deal, if I massage the numbers, I can make it work. Right? I can make it, and people have trusted me, so I can always I can always slip a deal through because they trust me, and but what that does is it just, you have this like enormous sense of responsibility for the people who have trusted you, and therefore I don't know. I just can't. The idea of bringing them something effectively lying to them is just like it violates some core like part of my obligation to them and their obligation. It's just like
you have a very strong moral compass when it comes to that, and I've been on the receiving end of that moral compass. I mean, I invested with you for a fund that ultimately didn't have any investments made, and you gave me my money back after a period of time when you said, I'm not going to be able to deliver on the promise that I made. And that's unusual, right? And it further builds with the people that get to experience that. It builds a tremendous amount of almost unbreakable level of trust.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. So from my perspective, that was actually an easy decision because I had promised some unlevered yield on cost. I think it was like 6.5 or whatever at the time. And I looked at deal after deal after deal, and it wasn't like I was seeing like 6.3s.
Right.
And I was like, well, maybe. It was like I was seeing 6s and high 5s. And I was like, I knew in my bones that it was not what I had promised people.
But I think you're inside the bubble and you probably don't appreciate that. For you, that feels like a very easy decision. For other people, it wouldn't be. And
yeah, that I can't. I mean, I can't comment on how other people think about the world.
And I'm not going to push you on this, but like the question I was asking was about what is it like to be looked upon as sort of a moral authority on things, and you sort of deflected and went back to, well, as a partner, it's this, right? And I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to push you, but I've seen you in public talk about other issues besides business where it is still very principled, and even if people disagree with you, it's done in a polite way, in the way that you present it, and it's respectful, and I think all of that in combination is differentiated and is part of your brand, whether you want it to be or not.
Well, look, I appreciate you saying that. I love Twitter. It's like separately, Twitter has made my life. Like it helped me get capital, and I've done reconvene this conference and reseed this other business. Like it's changed my life. Okay.
Yeah.
But separately from the business benefits, when I was in prep school with those smart friends, we used to sit around late at night and we would have these insanely aggressive, competitive, philosophical conversations.
Right.
Like they were like philosophical knife fights where like if you mispronouncing a word was enough for like everyone to jump on you and you lost the argument regardless of the merits. It was like that level of, and to the point, it was the kind of conversation that I think 99% of people would be like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Like you people are terrible. But I love that.
Yeah.
Okay. So for me, Twitter is like that.
Yeah.
And it's, and what's amazing about it is that it's like it's a pure intellectual meritocracy, right? Like you can be like a cartoon character with a funny name. And if you just say enough smart stuff, you can 5 minutes later or whatever, a year later, like you could be talking to the most successful people in the world. And it's like,
it's amazing.
It's amazing. Okay. So first of all, that's great. Yeah. But also the level of the discourse on there can be pretty low. Like people get angry and insult each other, and it's just like not productive. And so I learned from, it's funny because his publication that he started, well, first of all, he has a checkered career record, and then the publication that he just started is under fire right now. But the guy who started Business Insider, the one who, I can't think of his name now.
I don't remember his name either.
He was a disgraced Wall Street analyst. And he founded Business Insider. I noticed, I can't remember, I don't even think it was on, maybe it was on Twitter, or maybe it was like on some other pre-Twitter platform that I was on. I noticed that when he would argue with people, he always started with respectfully, comma, right? And what I realized was that his way of arguing with people turned the temperature down.
Yeah. It was about the ideas, not the people, not ad hominem.
Exactly. Right. And so, first of all, I just copied that, but also I've tried to assume good faith. It's when you're talking to someone, when you're exchanging ideas with someone in text, okay, as opposed to in person. Obviously, there's a lot of loss because there's not nonverbal communication. Right now, you're shaking your head and I'm using my hands and like that, that. So you have to assume good faith because you can't tell what the other person's intent. You're losing so much information. You can't tell what their intentions are.
Right.
So it's more productive to assume good faith. Just take the best version of their argument and not just try to make them look bad and score cheap points or whatever.
And to be more explicit and to be more careful in the word choices. Exactly.
And just, and I'm guilty sometimes when there are certain things that drive me really insane. One of which is I really hate cynicism I want to be careful. It drives me crazy when people who know better make arguments that are not valid.
Yeah.
It's like one thing if you don't know.
Right.
But if you know and you're doing that, it's cynical. And that just drives me insane. So that sometimes when I see that, it's very hard for me to
you get triggered.
Yeah, I do. But in general, I just try to to assume good faith, keep the temperature down, focus on the ideas, and really be positive. I mean, fundamentally, I'm so in touch with the idea that entrepreneurship in particular is incredibly hard and risky and takes everything you've got. So when I see people doing that in all fields, I just have a lot of respect for those people.
Yeah.
It's just a hard thing
really hard.
to will something into existence that wasn't there before. And basically, there's an enormous amount of inertia everywhere you look. Everything, the status quo is the status quo,
right?
Because it basically, everyone is at least not really upset about it. And some people are very happy about it, right? So if you're going to change the status quo, fundamentally, you're going to exert energy and you're going to disrupt things and people are going to push back because that's just the nature of it. And so I just have an enormous amount of respect and admiration for people who try to do it. And then I have even more for people who succeed at it. And so the way that I approach interacting with people who are engaged in that activity on Twitter is to be positive.
Right.
And because there's enough negativity and hard stuff coming from the rest of the environment that we're all operating in.
Yeah.
They don't need it from me.
Yeah. No, I get that. The other law that I think of besides the status quo that's almost direct opposite of that is the law of entropy. Right? I mean, it's so hard to hold these things together once you put them there that even that is worth a lot of admiration.
Dude, I'm in the long-term real estate ownership business. It's like a daily fight against entropy. You wake up every day pushing back against entropy until you die.
Right. Even just to keep things the way they are, not even to improve them.
Yeah. I mean, right. The paint's always peeling. The roof's always about to leak. The plants are always growing and eventually will need trimming. I mean, you name it. It's just in fact, I have an enormous amount of admiration for people specifically in the property management business because it's you wake up every day. There is no end. There's no exit. Right. It's not a startup where you're we went public. Hooray. It's nope. Just get up and go push that boulder back up the mountain. And it's just, it's a hard thing to do. And I've sort of signed up to spend my life doing it. And I admire other people who have as well.
Yeah. That's maybe a good segue into talking about, we talked about a lot of these personal transitions. Businesses go through the same thing. There are these inflection points or these crucible moments. What are some of those from your journey?
Well, from a downward perspective was my friend cutting us off and being you need to go raise your own capital. So that was one. More positively, the first meeting I had with that family that became our biggest investor, the guy I met with, who's a dear friend to this day, I met with him. I explained the business model, and he said, if you want to check for a couple $100,000, I'll just write a check right now. If you want a more material amount of money, we're going to have to negotiate the docs. And I was like, what's material? And he's like, I'll match whatever you raise from friends and family. And I was like, that's material.
Right. Let's talk.
Yeah. And what he wanted to negotiate was to his credit, and this is a wonderful way of behaving, they wanted control rights, but they did not come for the economics, which was very cool. They had so much leverage. They could have done anything. And they were, and it was actually quite a fee heavy vehicle because it was so small. We needed to be for us to live. So that was a huge turning point. I didn't realize at that time how much capital they had. And in some ways I didn't realize how much of a turning point it was at that moment, but it felt big, and it turned out it was even much bigger than it felt.
And that they were, it sounds like, at least as good of a partner as you expected them to be. In many ways, it sounds like better.
Oh my God. I can't even, we could do a whole nother podcast on all the things I've learned from them about both about real estate, but also just about life and being a good partner. And actually, interestingly, because I'm doing this reseed thing where I'm sort of in their shoes in the sense of providing capital to emerging operators. And so I find myself mirroring a lot of the ways that they behave towards me. I've internalized a lot and probably need to do even a better job of remembering those lessons and applying them. But yeah, they've just been, spectacular.
One of the dichotomies, and I think it's relevant here, that I am very aware of in the investor seat is the difference between being a relationship-oriented investor and a transactional investor, right? Am I just trying to optimize for the short-term monetary outcome, or am I really trying to be more of a partner for this? And it sounds like this person is very relationship
These guys,
oriented.
yeah. And it's two guys, and one's a family member and one's an outside family. And yeah, in fact, now that you mention it, one of the experiences that they have had repeatedly is they provide capital to a group.
Mm-hmm.
Things go well. They provide capital again. Things go well. And then the group comes and is basically like, fuck off. We're going to go get money from some private equity firm, or like, you know what I mean? Or like, oh, now
we've outgrown
you. Or the terms have now changed materially and screw you. Right. And it's just, I always thought that was such an insane way to behave, because this family in particular, they own a lot of real estate and it's not levered. And so they have tons of cash coming in all the time, and they pride themselves on investing counter-cyclically. So you're like, you idiots, you have this relationship with this family that has all this capital coming and money coming in that they want to put out. They are relatively parsimonious about it during times when it's easy to get capital, but they are willing to open the floodgates when it's hard to get capital. Why would you destroy your relationship with people like that? You know what I mean? Like, those are people you want to be in business with forever.
Right.
So I learned that, I guess I maybe learned that from them talking to me about those other relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've always treated them like, okay, we're going to be in business forever. And they've always treated me like that. And it's been incredibly
amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Is there another time that you can think of?
Sure. So when we were selling that initial portfolio of buildings that I did with my friend, I think I had already set the blog up, and I used to get emails whenever someone joined the mailing list. So, and I was in the habit, because each of these leads was so valuable, of Googling the person. I would like Google stalk whoever. So I get this, someone joined my mailing list. I look him up and I'm like, that name's familiar. And I realized that he had bid on one of the buildings that we sold. We didn't sell it to him, but and I realized further that he was a serious real estate guy. He owned a bunch of office buildings, basically. And I reached out to him and I said, I saw you join my mailing list. You bid on another building. Like, I'd love to have lunch, basically. And he agreed. And I sat down with him and explained how we did business.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether it was a day or a few days later, he came back and he was like, listen, my partner and I have this fund that we raise for office, but we don't think we're going to want to deploy it in office. We think we want to deploy it in your strategy. Would you do a deal for us with our own money first? And then if it goes well, we'll do more.
Yeah.
And we did it and it went well. And then we deployed I think a $70 million fund for them into our strategy. I think we renovated like 20 buildings for them. In retrospect, like, kind of dumb because we didn't get equity. These were fee deals.
Okay.
And, if I had had a mentor and better access to capital, blah, 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 we should have bought those deals ourselves, basically.
Right.
That's the truth of it. But that was, again, maybe if you think of the deals I did with my friend as, let's call it my undergraduate real estate experience, doing 20 deals with their money was effectively like grad school. And they had done a lot of, they were creative office developers. So they were used to buying old industrial buildings and turning them into cool offices. And with a willingness to do pretty out there stuff to the buildings. Like there was so much uplift in the value if you got if you got Google as a tenant. I think they had Twitter actually as a tenant. So they were like, oh yeah, should we expose the roof beams? Should we you name it? Should we start moving walls around? Should we, whatever you could think of that we thought would add value, they were willing to try. And it was their money. So we got to just, I think, like I said, I think we did 20 deals for them. And I think we did 10 for other investors that say also fee deals. And that there was a bunch of fee income that allowed us to support ourselves while we were still very subscale from a fundraising perspective. Also, those buildings became the core of our property management business. So that, like, for a very long time, they were 80% of our property, 70, eventually we worked them down. So now they're much smaller, but at the time they were, so that turned out to be like obviously totally transformative.
I thought that story was going to go in a different direction, and it sort of tied back in my mind to writing and discussing what you're doing publicly, which is the potential to create competitors through that, right? Have you experienced that?
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I probably created a generation of competition in Los Angeles, the truth of it. And I should have taken my blog down a long time ago. Like, in other words, there was a point where I had enough capital. I had these families that were willing, there's the one big family, but we probably have like 5 or 6 families that'll write a check for the whole thing. Yeah. The reason I kept it up, honestly, is that I did not, again, as I said before, I did not have a mentor. There were no books There were no podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
There was no, so I had to just like carve this path myself. And I made so many mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was cobbling together ideas and guidance from clients and investors and from my CPA and reading and whatever. But like, and so the blog, because I was writing it every day, was effective, is like almost like the story of that journey. And I leave it up because as like a kind of a gift to people who are on that same journey.
Mm-hmm.
So it has for sure created a bunch of competitors.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know.
Do you self-censor more now in what you do or say publicly?
There are a few topics that I regard as like the crown jewels,
mm-hmm.
where I think there's still alpha that I don't talk about.
Yeah, let's get into those. No,
I have talked about them plenty. Like, I think if you listen to everything I've ever, every podcast and read, I think you probably could get at a bunch of it. And certainly I've had the conversation with investors.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's out, the ideas are out there.
Yeah.
And many of them probably other people came up with also, or whatever. So it's not, I don't mean to say this isn't the medallion fund or something,
right.
But yeah, so I stay away from those few topics, but then I'm willing to talk about pretty much everything else.
Got it. To close this out, if you think of life as a bunch of chapters, and we'll say like the next chapter may be 5 years long, what are you thinking that chapter is about?
Well, as you know from our conversation before we started recording, it's a little up in the air. Look, the North Star for me has always been to build a large portfolio of minority control stakes in high quality real estate that I am in charge of managing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. With the idea of having that real estate pass along to my children.
Mm-hmm.
And ideally for the investors to pass their stakes along to their children. And so there's this really nice, like multi-generational story about the creation and preservation of wealth.
Legacy and continuity and stewardship.
And so that for sure is the North Star.
Mm-hmm.
Along the way, look, my father was a college professor for 40 years. If I had not been so greedy, I would have been a history teacher, probably like a high school history. I would have gone to Andover and taught history or something. So along the way, both through the blog, but then really through Twitter, opportunities have emerged for me to teach. Mm-hmm. And so I certainly have that impulse. Mm-hmm. And I think you can see in Reconvene, the event we do, and in Reseed, which we're seeding emerging GPs, that I've tried to sort of marry my greed to my desire to teach and inform. So I think that those are going to be the two, those will continue to be the two goals in my life. And I should say I'm reading, and everyone who follows me on Twitter knows this because I've been posting about it endlessly. I'm reading The Snowball right now, and it has actually been quite validating to read about Buffett's teaching streak. Mm-hmm. Like this guy was writing articles and publishing them. He was holding seminars. Yeah. He was teaching night school. And then eventually his annual letters, which I encourage everyone to read, are effectively it's like a textbook about business.
Yeah.
And so I think in some ways it's been validating to be reminded of that, because sometimes I feel like a fraud. Mm-hmm. Like I'm like going to be some business course teacher instead of being an investor and an operator of real estate. But the fact that the greatest investor of all time was simultaneously teaching kind of feels validating to me.
One of the topics that is present in my mind a lot lately is this notion of mentorship. How would you differentiate between teaching and mentorship?
My initial thought is just to say that teaching you can do at scale.
Okay.
And mentorship, it's a little bit harder.
It's
more one-on-one. I have never had mentors.
Mm-hmm.
In part because I always needed capital. Anytime I've sort of run across an older person who had money and was interested in our business, I've converted them into an investor.
But wait, why does that preclude them from being a mentor?
Because when you take someone's capital, it changes the relationship. Mm-hmm. It just does. This is not this isn't theoretical physics where you're sitting business is fucking hard, as you know. It's a knife fight to steal another one of B. Shore's concepts. There are mistakes. Mm-hmm. There are things that don't go. And there are decisions that you have to make that you're not proud of, or you're not sure of, and so I think with a mentor, you would ideally be able to fully, and maybe this is more like a parent or a psychologist or something like that. But at least in my like platonic ideal of mentorship, you could be fully open with the mentor about everything that you're facing. And I don't think that you can ever be totally transparent with investors in the same way.
Okay, I get that. My thinking on this has evolved over time. I've also not had many mentors, I think for different reasons that I won't go into, but I think that I have had mentors when I remove my platonic ideal of what a mentor is. Like people is more episodic mentors, in particular, like you're talking about the family office that you work with, right? They've been, it sounds like in the relationship approach. And now you said you're parroting a lot of those things or embodying those things when you talk to the reseed.
Sure. So
there's been a lot of mentorship there.
Very good point. So if you want to look at it, so the answer is maybe I'm full of shit. And actually I've had a bunch of mentors. I mean, the guy for whom I did all that fee development, the office, the guy who I was talking about before shaped my view of the world in a lot of ways.
Right. You take a little bit here, you take a little bit there. Yeah.
Yes. So I think if you're going to broaden the definition of mentor away from my platonic ideal, then for sure I have.
And the platonic ideal, at least in my mind, is sort of this Yoda-like figure, right? That is sort of all-knowing across all dimensions of life. You would go to them for just about anything and they would have wise counsel. They're invested in your success.
Yeah. I think maybe the crucial thing is that they're not financially interested. Mm-hmm. In other words, so that they're in a position where they can just sort of advise you in a way that is purely just them telling you what they think, sharing their wisdom.
Yeah.
And I would value that I just have never, some people do that. And this is another thing another lesson that I think I've learned and I regret that I have. There are people who seem to specialize in finding mentors and having those mentors sort of like pull them up quickly. Yeah. I mean, the best example that I can think of, I can think of so many, but just off the top of my head, the Steven Schwartzman story is about, basically what he did was like cultivated
the old bulls.
Old bulls of finance, and then eventually Pete Peterson. And like, that's, so it's just, it makes a remarkable difference. Like, these older experienced people are actually looking for young, ambitious people. And if you can internalize that and then go find them and mold yourself into what they're looking for, you get sort of like yanked up the ladder really quickly in a way that I didn't.
Yeah.
And so I regret in some ways, but I'm just like, to bring the conversation maybe a little bit full circle, like I've inherited it's weird because I'm sort of a people pleaser on one level, but I'm also fairly disagreeable. Like I am an independent person. You're
your father's son.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm not, the idea of sort of like venerating some mentor is like anathema to me. Like I don't, it's just, it doesn't sit well with me also.
Yeah.
I'm a bundle of contradictions.
As are we all.
Yeah.
Well, we could go on forever, I'm sure, and there's lots of other areas that would be really interesting to talk about, but let's put a pin in it here and get on with our days.
Thank you very much. And, I appreciate sincerely the conversation. It's great.
Likewise. Thanks, Moses. If you enjoyed today's episode, you can find transcripts and show notes at transitionspodcast.com. Please also feel free to share this episode on your favorite podcast player with friends and colleagues who might share an interest in exploring the most critical moments from the lives of today's business leaders.